we're now going to move on to the first of our panel sessions. And so I'm going to, as it's getting sorted out, I'm just going to do a brief introduction to our moderator, who is Professor Frances Fahy. And Frances is the director of the Ryan Institute and established professor of geography. Her research career to date has been targeted at supporting society, policymakers and other stakeholders to undertake necessary and significant transformation of unsustainable social systems. She's a scholar, somebody who's brought in huge monies into our university. She's a very serious person. She's somebody who I asked to help out with this a few weeks ago, and I don't know that she fully get that I was really going to be making her work very hard on this. So I appreciate all you've done for this work, Frances. I think because we're probably at around 12:15 now, is that correct? We'll probably go until 12 or till 1:15. We'll have our lunch then. I know that at least one colleague will have to, it'll be a hard 1 o'clock, so that's fine. But if we're happy to go with that, Frances, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Gur míle maithagad, John, agus fáilte léir go dtí Ollscoil na Gaillimh san Tráthnóna seo. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing a wonderful panel for you this afternoon. With us today we have representatives from a variety of interests, or a variety of organisations, and our own is represented here as well. So we have Tanya Bonatti, CEO of Creative Ireland. We have Paddy Mahon, who is the Chief Executive of Longford County Council and Chairman of the local government management agency. We then have Naomi Feely, who's policy officer with Children's Rights Alliance, and our own Eleanor Flynn, established professor at the School of Law here and director of the Centre for Disability in Law and Policy. And then we have down the end, and I'm coming to you first, Niamh, with my first question, but Niamh Garvey is the Senior Policy Analyst with NESC, so the National Economic and Social Council. And part of the reason I wanted to come to you first is essentially NESC is created, its very purpose is about engagement around policy. So perhaps by way of introduction, Niamh, you might just tell us a bit about your experience and involvement in, if you like, bringing stakeholders engagement in policy.
Great, this is on, is it? Great,
so, yeah.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. It's been a really fantastic morning. So I guess we've heard, particularly from Sally when she was laying out, I guess, the different aspects of engagement. When we think about who we engage, there's citizens directly, and then there's maybe representative kind of groups. So the NESC Council, I guess, is more in that vein of a representative group. So NESC is, it's chaired by the Department of the Taoiseach. It has a number of senior departmental representatives on it. The majority of the members of the council are from the 5 social pillars. So we have the trade unions, the business employer groups, community and voluntary pillar, farming representative groups, and environmental pillar. And I think what's important there, some of our similar institutes to us in different countries, they might be nominated on, but in NESC's situation, each of the pillars, nominate their own representatives on. So it's sort of that bottom-up representation across those pillars. And there are also a number of independent members, often from the research and academic community. So I guess its role and function, it's standing, it's been there for 50 years. Sometimes consultation and engagement might be one-off processes. In NESC's case, I guess it's a part of the system, part of the policy system. And we provide policy advice based on research, but that dialogue with these stakeholders is at the core of it. So the advice comes from the council to government, to the department, through the Department of the Taoiseach, dealing with maybe complex or knotty policy issues, but on many different areas: housing, transport, social welfare, climate action, any sort of the big policy issues. So I think, that gives maybe a flavour of, but I think when I mentioned that it's the stakeholder representative groups, NESC has, I suppose, consistently across many of these different policy issues, underlined the importance of engagement at localised levels as well, so that looking at the policy system, I think the engagement of people very close to the lived real experience has come out in countless of NESC's reports. The importance of engagement at that scale, as well as maybe in the higher level policy making process, is really important.
Thanks so much, Niamh. And again, energy, reflecting on Una's has been a major focus of NESC's work that I've been slightly familiar with over the last few months. Naomi, I might turn to you next. Given your 20 years of research, analysis and policy, I'm just, from that lobbying perspective, you're here representing the NGO sector. Could you perhaps, by way of introduction, tell us about your experience and maybe even what the value you see in public participation?
Sure. So I suppose I've worked for over 20 years undertaking research policy analysis, mainly in the NGO sector. And so what does that mean in terms of the policy making process? I suppose we've been really struck by this idea maybe today that we are looking at researchers and policy makers, and where do NGOs sit within that? I think very much they can sit in between those two processes, but more relevant really is the collaborative approach that can be undertaken with the NGOs really as a key stakeholder. So I'll give a couple of examples maybe from some work we've recently done. A key objective of the Children's Rights Alliance, we join over 150 members right across Ireland to advocate in relation to children and young people, very much keeping that UN Convention on the Rights of a Child as our real guide map as to what needs to happen for children and young people in Ireland. We really very strongly rely on evidence to build up the case for what we really advocate needs to happen in various policy areas. For example, one of the things we were working on in the last 2 years was really advocating for a focus on investment in an early years programme that would tackle disadvantage. And one of the ways in which we really collaborated both with policymakers and decision makers in departments, but also with academics, was we commissioned a piece of research that looked at what is the international perspective on this, what do we know from other countries, what perspectives can we bring to bear on the Irish policy making process. So commissioned researchers to do that. So we're relying on that expertise in universities right across Ireland. This was one example where we engaged with researchers in UCC, but then taking that research and using it in the context of lobbying the government in the run-up to government. So, for us, that was really analysing the research and saying, okay, what does this mean? What does this mean to children and families right across Ireland? But what is the argument that we can make to government? But more particularly, where can we make that argument? For us, we published that research a week or two before the budget. We looked at trying to get media coverage on it, and our CEO was on, I think it was the This Week show on a Sunday, where all political I suppose representatives of that are listening and are engaging in what is the discussion that is being had and how can that influence the process of the budget.
Thank you so much, Naomi. So much to come back to there. We'll be back to evidence building in a few minutes and all of those activities. But I'd like to turn to you now, Paddy. Both our keynote obviously talked about bringing the community along the journey with you, and I'm very conscious of the important role that local authorities play when we have this discussion about public engagement and public policy. So perhaps you might, by way of introduction, give us a sample of the work that you're involved in.
Thanks very much. And this morning it's been fascinating, the updates on the launch of the policy handbook, and also Sally's and Una's presentation has been very informative. Since 2014, local authorities have been formally responsible for the community development as well as all the other areas we cover. So engaging with our communities through a plethora of means, I suppose, is key to what we do. Not doing it in isolation either, but doing it in collaboration with government departments, depending on the different elements of the, I suppose, the policies or the services that need to be rolled out. So that's a key thing. But I suppose one example I could give you, which is more recent, is in the area of community safety, which is it's a new initiative in the area of community policing, I suppose. That's and the sponsoring department is the Department of Justice. So we in Longford were chosen as a pilot about 3 years ago. So that involved us kind of working obviously very closely with the department and indeed understanding what community safety was to our communities in County Longford. And it's a small rural county, but yet 1 in every 3 of the population was born outside the country. So it identified a lot of challenges in that area, I suppose. But it's funny, I took down the notes of Sally's key, and I had to put on my glasses here for this if it's okay. Our key messages are the takeaways. To embed engagement, be proactive, build engagement muscles and mindset, test and learn, and socialise the handbook, which was launched this morning. And I consulted with my colleague, who's the coordinator for community safety in Longford yesterday, just what are the key issues in terms of consultation. So identifying all the stakeholders and engage very early was one of the key ones. And develop a culture of consultation, which is very similar to Sally's, embed the engagement in the department. So have every section of your council involved in consultation in a very deep way, and provide training for your teams. Make it meaningful and accessible to your communities, understand your communities, engage very early, as I said. And one phrase that she gave me that kind of struck with me was, do what's easy, don't do what's easy for us, do what's easy for your consultees, for your stakeholders. And I think we're for a variety of reasons, we tend to default back to the do what's easy for us. And I think Una's first presentation, where she gave the statutory element of the consultation process with the offshore wind energy firms. Like, we have to do that, and that's easy because we're well trained to do that, and we have teams of professionals that can do that. But you also have to consider your stakeholders and understand what's easy and difficult for them. So as I said earlier, and I don't want to overspend my time here, but 1 in 3 of our community in Longford are from outside of the country, and a lot of those people come from countries or societies where they don't trust people in uniforms, they don't trust authority, and they're very difficult to engage with. So it's a significant challenge to understand who they are, what they are, how can we get to talk to our new communities in a language and in a space that they're comfortable with and they can understand. And I think that's key really in a modern Ireland in terms of developing any policy. We have a complete new society, we have new communities, and engaging with those communities it's a wonderful challenge to have, but it must form part of any engagement process that we're about now. And to be fair, the handbook is very, very key in how that's going to be delivered now and into the future.
Thank you, Paddy, because that's exactly it. Ensuring, obviously, public engagement approaches are inclusive. Both of our speakers have referenced that. I thought, Una's points there about accommodating differences, people at different priorities in their lives, different life stages. And Creative Ireland has been doing an awful lot of work around design thinking and really creative ways of obviously engaging the public and wider policy development. Would you speak to us about that?
I suppose picking up on Paddy, the one thing I wish Sally had spoken a bit more about was creative ways of engaging. But picking up on what Paddy said about doing what suits the person, not what suits the system, we in Creative Ireland have been very inspired by the action plan on design that the government has. So Liz mentioned service design. We are big believers in human-centred design and designing from the citizen back. So when Una's colleagues in DEC approached us and said, people are not turning up for these meetings about retrofitting their home and taking the bus, this may seem kind of odd, but we said we believe that the talents of artists and the creative community can really engage people on climate action. And in fairness to our colleagues in DEC, they were like, okay, what does that look like? And it looked like an extraordinary variety of things, but starting where the person is and using really experienced designers to get there. So to give you 2 different examples, Una talked about the just transition. It was thanks to UCC that we realised in Creative Ireland that some of our projects were reaching people who are not targeted normally under the just transition. So people with Down syndrome, people with literacy issues, neurodiverse people, not normally included in community climate action projects. But by doing something where we designed from them backwards, hiring some of the best service designers in the country, we did something that really engaged them and which hadn't been done elsewhere. So you can do that with communities that are not normally targeted. But we also had examples where the Institute of Designers in Ireland said, we would like to use the talents of service designers in Maynooth University, in NCAD, to reach into chartered directors of companies using design thinking and design approaches to think about their climate obligations. So I would just give a shout out for creative methods of engagement. And truly, if you really, really believe in putting the people first and not the system first, then the system has to be willing to change. We have to be willing in government departments to change how we do public engagement.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I'd like to bring Eleanor in here with regard to, making public engagement, obviously approaches just more inclusive. You've been working on this for a number of years, Eleanor. Could you give us
it follows on really nicely from what the other speakers have been saying, because my work is in disability and because I have been working with different groups in civil society, different NGOs and organisations led by disabled people to try to influence law and policy. One of the biggest pieces of law that we worked on was the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act, which gives people who might need some support to make their decisions the options to do that instead of removing their autonomy entirely, as we had under the old law, which was the ward of court system dating from Victorian times, from the Regulation of Lunacy Ireland Act 1871. So we've only gotten rid of that law in the last few years, and even the law that has replaced it is by no means perfect, and I'm quite vocally critical of the law that's replaced it. But I suppose I would have thought as a researcher, my job was to just say what was wrong and hand that over then to the NGOs and to the departments to figure out, what to do with it. And I realised quite early on that I was going to have to get my hands a lot more dirty than that, and that involved working with a coalition of over 15 organisations, from older people's organisations, disabled people's organisations, and people who've experienced the mental health services, working collaboratively together to try to each get what they wanted out of this piece of law. And we did not get a lot of the things we wanted, but we wouldn't have gotten anything if we hadn't worked together, and if we hadn't brought to bear, I suppose, the knowledge of researchers and my colleagues in other countries who had engaged in similar processes about how do you start, who should we be bringing into the circle, how do we approach this when we make the arguments to government. And we were very fortunate to be working with Amnesty Ireland at the beginning of our work, who had a political liaison, dedicated person who hung out in Leinster House all day and taught me how to make my long, whiny arguments into 3 bullet points that he could sell to somebody in a coffee break. And this was really useful, because that is what you needed to do in order to, so much of what Sally was saying as well, about think about what people's constituencies are, think about what motivates them, what will resonate with them about the experience that you're trying to get across. And so I suppose being part of that translation work as a researcher, not just, leaving that to the NGOs, getting down in there with them, working with them to do that, was really valuable. And it's one of the most valuable things that I've given my energy to.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Eleanor. And looking at that international examples, we were talking about what academics can bring, and want to draw all the panel in on this conversation in a second, but this whole idea, and it's referred to in the policy handbook there, about data and evidence alone is not economic policy, but without it, obviously, we're looking at informed policy and the importance of having a solid and sound evidence base. And I know from previous conversations with my panelists that they all have, many of them have thoughts on this. And I wonder, Eleanor, could I draw you again, this idea of maybe access to good practice from other countries, and what it means to have a solid, sound evidence base, or that perhaps the challenges sometimes involved in that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that combination between stories and stats and how you can draw those from local and from global environments. Because one example I'll give, in the process of developing this act and meeting with officials again and again about it, where I brought, from my perspective, the best international experts to sit with them and be like, you need to do this. Ireland needs to lead this change that's happening around the world. It'll be so exciting. Everyone is watching to see what the Irish government does on this law. And here's how you can do it, and here are some examples. And people not being convinced, because it was still very early days in this new thinking about how people could be supported, and can people really make these kinds of decisions? What about people with really severe impairments or disabilities? Is it really possible? Is this just pie in the sky? And no matter how many times I had the international experts come, it still wasn't hitting home. And then I had a meeting with the officials, with a group of people who were directly impacted by this law, and one of the women in the group said to one of the lead officials about some change that we had been trying to convince them for ages would need to be made. She brought it back to her personal experience and her situation in her family, and suddenly the door was open, and we were able to get progress on that, even though all of the international experts had also said that. But it wasn't until someone said, well, you're going to put me in this really difficult situation in my family if you continue to move forward with this approach. And they were like, oh, right, okay, it does have impact on real people that are directly in front of us and telling us about it. And now, I can't say for sure that is what transformed it, but I do think that moment was really important.
Thanks, Eleanor. And Niamh, can I bring you back in here with regard to that idea of that perhaps solid evidence base, or the role of maybe academics and your own researchers in creating or forming this sort of evidence for which we can move forward with? Or I know we had a brief conversation about it before.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what was really striking from the discussion so far and some of the presentations earlier, I suppose, of what counts as evidence. So I suppose, and depending on the policy issue at stake, if we're talking climate, I mean, hard climate science is obviously a really critical pathway in. Key data on all kinds of policy areas are vital. But I was really struck by, I think, Sally's point as well on, I suppose, understanding, we've just heard as well, that understanding of lived experience as also a really important part. And I think, I mean, referring back maybe to Nesk's work as well, when we're dealing with maybe the kinds of complex policy issues that involve sort of trade-offs and synergies, that involve maybe impacts on people's lives, as we heard from Una as well, that bringing those kind of perspectives either from different stakeholder groups, so in some of the work that we've done on agriculture and land use, the perspectives of ecologists alongside the perspectives of farmers, and people with the sort of lived experience of how policy affects them. When you put a policy problem or a challenge that we're trying to face and collectively try and sort of co-create solutions with the creativity, I think that's really, really important. These kind of creative approaches, I think, can sometimes help you come up with not the obvious policy solutions. And in Nesk's work, certainly, I suppose, I mean, it would be simplistic to say that the different pillars might have very different perspectives or different interests to each other. And I suppose sometimes we talk about it, it's not about trying to find that sort of lowest common denominator of agreement on something, but something much more creatively getting beyond that. When we unpack a problem and think of solutions creatively, I think we're bringing to bear these different types of evidence, some of which are traditional research, core data and so on. But a big part is also those different perspectives. And I think that's where the magic, let's say, happens of coming up with the types of creative or new policy solutions that can gain traction, but that maybe hadn't been maybe on the agenda or on the radar before.
Thank you very, very much, Niamh. And obviously, I welcome our panellists. Yeah, Naomi.
Yeah, I was just going to come in there around the piece on evidence. I suppose from our perspective, we have a network of 150 members right across Ireland, and there is this kind of question of making the leap between something someone told you and what's the evidence around that. Certainly we hear from our members all the time issues that are emerging for children, young people and their families. I'm thinking in particular around the issue of reduced timetables. So taking that, making the time to gather the evidence and then analysing that within the context of what's currently happening in government is really critical. But kind of picking up on Niamh's point around, the different perspectives coming together, I do think that one of the things that we can all do, and that's researchers, policymakers, decision makers, NGOs, is really try and flip our thinking so that we can see the perspective of the other person. So what is the perspective of the NGO? For us, it's advocating on behalf of children and young people, but when we go to lobby the government or to inform the development of policy, I think it's really critical that we also think what is in a civil servant's mind and what is their perspective. Their perspective is in terms of delivering a commitment in the programme for government. So how might we need to not, as Niamh was saying, come to agreement on the lowest common denominator, but how can we kind of all collaborate together to understand what is the solution to this problem? And I think that is really critical. One thing I think maybe we haven't talked about already, but I know that the point was made earlier around the citizens' assemblies. Again, I think that's a really critical part of the policy-making process. Certainly from the work we've been doing around advocating for a public model of childcare, we can see that this was one of the recommendations arising out of the citizens' assembly. So that's a great opportunity to almost sense check or have, a temperature check with what are our citizens that have really considered these ideas in depth. How are they aligning with what NGOs are advocating for, or the direction that policy making is going on? And I think that's really critical as well.
Thank you,
I mean, I think sometimes what's in a civil servant's head, I'm a big believer in the storytelling. We do a lot of storytelling workshops. We do a lot of empathy. You tell my story, I tell your story. I get that. But I also know, as a newish civil servant, that oftentimes civil servants will be saying, is this capture? Am I simply talking to somebody who has a very strong lived experience of this, but this is not representative of the population as a whole? So that is something I think as policymakers we're always going, have I reached, in our case, have we reached the poorest of the poor? Have we reached every child, not just the professional young people who seem to be in some of these groups? So sometimes as a civil servant you're there going, that's a very powerful lived experience and you clearly know this issue very well, but I have many constituencies. So sometimes there is that fear that maybe we're being swayed too much by that personal story. I'd also like to talk about failure, not a word that was mentioned this morning. I'm always interested that policymakers talk about, the action plan on design talks about iteration, and Sally talked about test and learn. We like to talk about failure. We're really interested in failure in Creative Ireland. We want to know why things failed. Did we fail? Did your project fail? How did it fail? Please be honest with us and live that all the time as a group so that people can kind of go, look, I tried that policy maker, I tried that approach, but that is not scalable. So I think we also need to use terms that the public like failure or, you know, when we talk about relational versus transactional, how are we really giving back to these people who perhaps are giving of their time? You know, what's in it for them, putting ourselves in their shoes and helping feel that they're getting something back from being involved in this public engagement.
Thank you, Tony, because that I was hoping that the panel would reflect. I mean, we're here this afternoon to have this wonderful opportunity, experiences that the G have in this field, but some of the challenges that you're facing, because colleagues will be interested in, and not talking enough about failure is a really core point and something we try and do in academia. But can I draw any of the panels in on that, in panel members, some of the challenges that, you know, when you're engaged with this work, and what are the main?
Yeah. If I can add, I suppose, I think of that particular law that I'm talking about in two different ways. So one is that, like, we have the law we have now and we have to make the best of it. And so when I teach people about the law that exists, I try to teach it in the way of, like, just use this part over here. This part is not great. Let's not worry too much about that. Let's try and use the positive elements of the law as much as possible and avoid people ending up in the parts of the law that I feel are quite restrictive and potentially harmful for people. But obviously then, when I talk about the law, you know, in like an international context or with my other colleagues doing this work, we talk about, well, we won here, but we failed here. Like, we had one major win in the law, which was we removed any reference to best interest because this law is about adults and not about children. So we were able to get past that paternalistic way of thinking to some extent, but we had a major failure in the law as well. And I think we need to acknowledge that and talk about it, especially because other countries are engaged in this process of law reform on this very same topic, and Ireland will sometimes do a very good PR job of itself in terms of internationally selling the message that, you know, we revolutionised this, we're at the forefront of human rights in this aspect. And I'm really conscious that we need to acknowledge where we did not do that in this law and not allow other countries to follow a sort of a cut-out pattern for this, where it doesn't map onto what their context is. And also, one of the ways in which we failed is that we didn't design this law from the bottom up by asking people what actually would work for them. We took a set of categories that we thought probably most people will fit in one of these categories and that will solve most issues. But we didn't actually ask people, and so my main advice would be, when people ask me what have we learned from the Irish experience of this law, is you need to figure out what you want from scratch and then design the law to follow, and not, you know, be left dealing with a law that doesn't really fit what people wanted, or they were never even asked what they wanted to begin with, and something was just presented which we then had to react to.
Thanks, Eleanor. And Paddy, did you want to come in there on some of the challenges experienced and what we could all or should all be aware of when we embark in this work?
Yeah, and just to kind of tap into the failure sort of term, and go back to Una's presentation, and the climate action challenge, I suppose, is to that we really transform our society, and the challenge is to be net zero by 2050. And, you know, even now the commentary is we're not going to achieve that, and, you're moving into failure territory there, and it's I think a lot of this is around language. It's about it's about kind of retaining and remaining confident that we're on the right journey. Hopeful, absolutely, and how do we get the best out of all our resources to kind of maybe understand that some people might see that as a failure if we don't achieve. So supposing we don't, I don't know how many 100,000 electric vehicles we're supposed to be on the road by the end of 2030. You'll see the headlines, a kind of climate action plan doomed not to achieve or to fail on that. Retrofitting our houses, there's a target there. And these targets are set for the right reason. But by not achieving targets, or by looking like you're not going to, the term failure can kind of bring down the argument or bring down people's confidence. And in our role, and Una mentioned it, the engagement with the communities to build confidence and build capability in communities and citizens. We've worked very closely with our department over the years to develop a community climate action plan. Community climate action officers are in every local authority in the country, funded by Una's department, and they're very pivotal in building that story, building the positive stories about the things we as either councils or we as communities or individual citizens can do to kind of play their part in what is dealing with an existential crisis. So failure needs to be discussed, but the alternative is much more, I think, encouraging and more positive. And we put our hands up as local authorities to say we will be leaders in this space. So we will achieve our targets. We'll get our energy efficiency down to 50% by 2030. We're probably ahead of that target by now. We'll reduce our emissions, maybe not by 50% by 2030, but we'll go a long way towards doing that. But we'll show others the way. And again, Una mentioned, by one person doing it or one group doing it or one body doing something positive, it will encourage and empower others to do it. So I think fair play to you for bringing up the word, but it's something to be wary of. Because you can see it across the world now. There's a move back away from net zero. There's a move. Even former Prime Minister kind of probably inadvertently said that in the UK a few weeks ago, that he thought the net zero targets in the UK weren't achievable. So you're introducing the concept of not achieving something in a space where all government policy and science seem to be saying there's no alternative at the moment.
Thanks, Paddy. And Niamh, you want to come in here?
Yeah, just on that issue of challenge. One of the really powerful parts of stakeholder citizen engagement is at that more localised level. So I was recently involved in the land use review phase 2. There was a citizen engagement working group as part of that process. And the members of that group were really interested in learning from what works. I guess the opposite of the failure. But so there's many examples of, there's European innovation partnerships, there's LIFE programs, a whole range of community projects as well, where at, I suppose, a landscape level or at a more localised level, there have been really successful land use change projects that have delivered for agricultural stakeholders, delivered for multiple environmental objectives and so on. And what was at the heart, the piece of work that we were doing was looking at what has made these successful, and stakeholder engagement was right at the core of that, and the flexibility for farmers to adopt different practices in different ways, which was quite different from more traditional environmental schemes. There were other parts of it as well, so multi-stakeholder groups at, again, quite a landscape local level, groups like Teagasc together with the EPA or other ecologists and so on. So those multiple perspectives at, I suppose, a structural level as well as the engagement at the citizen level, really, really important. But the big learning from that then was the question, well, how do we scale? If this is like a really successful model of supporting land use change, which is challenging, it is politically sensitive, it's all of these things, but these were examples of where everyone universally felt very positive about them. The scaling of that is challenging and difficult. So the Acres Cooperation Programme are an attempt to do that, and they really try and embrace the spirit of that flexibility, results-based payments, engagement. But I think it was referred to before, but I suppose they're hitting, I guess, what's been our more traditional way of managing agri-environment schemes. So there's been delays and challenges there, but a lot of positivity of the intent to do things a little bit differently. So it raises for me that sort of challenge that was mentioned, I think by Tanya or someone else on the panel, of if we have this ambition for, there's already a lot of brilliant engagement in the policy system. But if we want to scale it and deepen it and make it even more meaningful, there is the capacity within the system as well is a key challenge that we need to grapple with.
Niamh, thank you so much, because that whole area or the whole topic of scaling up, scaling out, I'm very conscious many people have different opinions on it. Naomi, did you want to come in?
I was going to speak about one challenge. I find it challenging to think about the challenges or the failures, but certainly, you know, in the work around child poverty, we've done a lot of work over the last number of years, and we've seen significant progress across a number of different areas. But one that we find quite challenging is around income. And over 20 years ago, I was involved in a piece of research which looked at establishing what does it cost to live at a low cost but acceptable standard of living. And that work has really evolved into the MESL research work. Anybody familiar with social income adequacy research will be familiar with that. But for us, I suppose we can clearly show from evidence that many people dependent on in receipt of social welfare income are not living on an adequate income, and so the policy ask for us is that we would target increases in income supports towards those families with children who are in receipt of social welfare. But what's really challenging is then when we bring that into the political domain, there can be perhaps the idea that, well, if we give all families an increase in child benefit, for example, you know, that's very politically palatable if it's around election time or that. So how do we, you know, kind of overcome that, the politicalness of targeting supports to families living in poverty? I think that's, you know, one part of it. It's not always just about what the evidence shows, but we have to consider that within the wider framework, and also within the framework of what does our economy look like now? What are the decisions that our political representatives want to make? What is you know, how will that be perceived by the public who are ultimately re-electing them? I think that's really critical to consider that, not only when we're lobbying for change, but then what is the impact for people trying to implement change as well?
Thank you very much, Naomi. And one of the questions we asked, you know, each of our panelists just to consider before the panel, given our setting here at the University of Galway, was really how do we maximise that kind of cooperation between cooperation and mutual understanding, really, between that research context and the public's policies, civil servants, you know, that sort of context. So I'd love to hear your reflections on you know, looking at ways of maximising cooperation, whatever the scale of suggestions are. We're definitely all open ears.
I mean, I think I will be honest and say we really struggle with working with universities because of the usual problems, which is the grind of the estimates process, the budget, meets the immovable structures of ethics clearance and etc. So we're there saying we really need the university's insight, and then the university comes back and says we need 6 more months. But picking up on Una's 50 million for research and innovation, and I'm sure Maurice probably has a fantastic budget, there are some government departments that have really big research budgets and clearly have a research strategy and are mapping it out. I think the challenge for departments that don't have big research budgets is to get better at understanding the challenges facing universities in terms of how does the policy making system, which is under pressure, estimates, budget in October and we're on, and you come to me in February, it's too late, we've already chased on. So I looked at all those papers hanging in the lobby there going, fascinating learning, but how do we match it up? And those are real challenges that we do have to acknowledge, that there are different ways of thinking, of proceeding, and so matching the university talents with the policy making process is very challenging.
Thanks, Tanya. Indeed. Paddy.
Yeah, just again to follow up on that, to link the third level government, national policy and local authorities that tend to be at the delivery end of the phase, whatever the policy is. And I'll go back to climate again and our relationship with Una's department. Each local authority delivered a climate action plan 3 or 4 years ago. And also we developed a strategy for the sector of the area climate action in advance of that. But one of the key parts of that was to, I suppose, empower and engage and train our people across the local authorities in the area of climate action, because it's a relatively new challenge to all of us, and including our sector. But because of the very good collaboration between the department and ourselves, and indeed third level, we developed a training programme that was funded more or less fully by the Department of Environment and Climate, delivered primarily by third level, and in some cases our own local authority national services training network, where we've rolled out training at different levels depending on the requirement of our different teams, whether you're front office, whether you're involved in Creative Ireland, or whether you're involved in technical sort of energy sort of projects. So up until recently, the first round of programme saw delivery of training to about 25,000 of our 30,000 staff across the sector over a few years. So that collaboration, that output wouldn't have been possible without a good, strong collaboration between, as I said, the policymakers in government, the third level institutes, and our own sort of local delivery teams. So there's good collaboration there already, and it can only be sort of strengthened, I think, into the future if we're going to continue to do what we're doing.
Thank you, Paddy. Naomi?
Yeah, I think it's really critical that we don't just think about policymaker and academics coming together. Like, as I was saying earlier, I think that partnership approach is really important. I know there are some funding available through through Research Ireland, whether it's through the new foundation scheme, whereby NGOs can partner with academics to deliver on a small piece of research, which can really be maybe the start of a wider project. But I think for NGOs it's really critical, because you're getting this really high-skilled expertise from academic institutions to create the evidence for you. And then oftentimes in NGOs, we have the capacity to maybe translate that, as Eleanor was saying, into that easy soundbite. Or oftentimes NGOs have developed those relationships with policymakers and are able to know where is the right opportunity to deliver the impact from this research. And I think that that's really critical.
Can I just make a little plea there, Naomi? Yes, the involvement of NGOs. We would love to see more artists involved also. And I get that it's really hard for universities. We spoke about that last night, but I've been really impressed by the Mare Centre in UCC and how they involve artists in all of their climate research. So there are universities that manage to do it despite procurement and frameworks, and I think that's really important. I was at an event recently, I hope there's nobody from Research Ireland here, where Professor Olmeyer, the head of humanities in Trinity, stood up and said, we are sick of being asked in the humanities to gussy up a poem and a bit of art at the end of this SFI project. You know, we want parity of esteem, and all the artists stood up and cheered. But I know that artists sometimes struggle working in universities, but getting that creative perspective in alongside the scientists. I'm begging you to please face down procurement and help make that happen.
And I think, Tanya, you did notice our creation of our new Creativity Institute here within the university, and something obviously it's very core within the College of Arts, Social Sciences and Celtic Studies here as well. Eleanor, you wanted to come in
Yeah,
there?
I think like building on what Naomi has said as well, that the universities can be sort of a meeting point for these different perspectives. And, you know, we've provided, it would be lovely to have more opportunities to provide space for people from both the activist or NGO sector, as well as for policymakers to have a sabbatical, an opportunity to breathe and reflect and think about what they've done and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And if we can facilitate that as universities, I would very much see that as just as having an artist in residence, having an activist in residence, having a policymaker in residence. There's a lot more creative ways that we can think about bringing these different perspectives together. So I would think that's a good way, as well as some of the other kind of exchange things that Sally mentioned earlier as well, like being able to have policymakers embedded in some of the community-led organisations that they are engaging with, in order to, you know, as a secondment, as a period to understand how does this organisation actually function and what are the things that they're really struggling with, and to literally make the tea for people and take the minutes and figure out how the next budget is going to get in, because those are the things that people actually have to do. And I think if policymakers had because of the way in which I suppose the civil service is designed, and that people are generalists and they move and they have to be able to engage with different topics, often very valuable institutional memory can be lost when people move on. So having something embedded, and maybe universities can support that, to try to ensure that that knowledge transfers and isn't lost.
In both ways, it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
There's a retired Secretary General here, but to have arrived at this point in your career to be, with the University of Galway. I know very few full-time civil servants that spend that time in academia, and very few knowing sometimes when we talk to researchers, they haven't ever had to do a brief for a minister, get that pre-budget, where's the value for money? So they're writing policy briefs that just aren't connected because they haven't had the experience of working in an agency or department. So a lot more permeability.
Great. Well, I suppose in the context of NESC, I suppose we have, I don't know if you'd call it maybe the luxury of that the focus tends to be the medium to longer term, and so I think there's really useful collaborations and engagement with academic institutions and actors in the development and provision of advice from the council. But I suppose maybe from my exposure, let's say, to colleagues within departments, and even as part of the development of the policy handbook, where I assisted some of the facilitation of some of the sessions with colleagues across different departments who were giving feedback on an earlier draft. I suppose sometimes this issue of maybe a mismatch between some of the time scales, quite urgent and very short time scales of policy development, hitting maybe the sort of longer time scales within maybe the more academic community, and how to bridge, how to bridge that. There were a number of people involved in those workshops on the handbook who maybe were reflecting on quite a high use of consultancies, in policy development among, I suppose, those big consulting agencies, and maybe a degree of discomfort about that, and a questioning of that. I suppose then having the capacity either in-house or maybe within institutions with those longer-term partnerships, such as the academic. And I suppose I'm not giving an answer to that, but I think the question of maybe the time frames and that alignment of academic and policy-making time frames is maybe a little bit of a barrier to maybe a higher potential engagement between the two that I think would be great to reflect on.
Thank you very, very much, Niamh. Thanks, reiterating and echoing your point as well, Tanya, about the how everything lines up. I have one or two final questions for the panel, but I just really wanted to offer the audience an opportunity, if there was a burning question you might have for one of our excellent panelists today, this might be the opportunity to ask it. Great, thanks.
You hear me all right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, perfect. What do I say to my colleague who thinks this is a waste of time? Or how do I convince them of the benefits? And kind of more what I'm asking is, how do we align ourselves in the short to medium term to follow the principles outlined in the handbook? I guess everyone in this room is probably bought into that already, but I'm wondering more about the people maybe who aren't here. And I don't mean us versus them, because we're all part of the same system.
Thanks so much, because one of my last questions to them are, what were the main messages? So what are the key points that we can talk about? Why is this engagement, why is public engagement so important and vital, and how can we communicate that? So
because it totally changes how I feel about the world and the work that we do. The minute we really, really listen to children, and under the Hub na Nóg framework, we have to report back. So it's not just, there's an awful lot of listening, but when you go back to young people and say, look, I did this, but I couldn't do that, it completely revolutionised Creative Ireland's work and how are we offering creative opportunities for children. So if you follow truly consulting young people, circling back, telling them what you're doing and not doing, it's got to change how you do, how you work and how you approach things. So that's the prize, that if you do public engagement properly, you'll do it better.
Yeah, I think the three key themes, that it's evidence-based, that it's feasible and it's legitimate, that all of those three, you need 9 out of 10s in all of those three areas to convince your colleague that it's worthwhile. And it's not just, as we mentioned earlier, doing the statutory engagement. It's much more than that, and it involves taking it planning it, taking it a series that it requires to be throughout the whole process, and having a clear embedded culture, I think, of consultation across whatever organisation or group you're involved in.
Yeah, can I ask, are you from a civil servant background or a research background? Civil service background. I suppose, why would you do public engagement? I think it can really open our eyes to seeing the problem from a different perspective. I suppose I'm coming slightly from the outside, and you know, when I saw the policy handbook, I was like, oh, this is for civil servants. But then actually when I got into it, I realised this is very much for everybody who's concerned about policy making. I can totally see how our organisation could follow the processes and the steps that are outlined in terms of gathering evidence, in terms of being involved in each of those steps in the process. I think we often think of, or maybe in the past, we used to think about these policies being designed by somebody sitting at a desk typing them out or whatever, but really public engagement, what that gives you the opportunity is to improve the policies you're developing. It gives you the opportunity to hear about them from a different perspective, whether it's, you know, the example that Eleanor gave, which was really powerful in terms of somebody saying, this is how it's going to impact my life, but just even hearing about how it's going to impact the life of a collective group of people, I think that that's really powerful, and ultimately you're going to deliver or implement a better policy by engaging with different perspectives. And we can probably think about that in other aspects of our life. I'm a bit of a book nerd. I love reading because it gives me an insight into another experience that somebody has had that I'm not open to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's where you derive your legitimacy from, as Tanya said. I mean, if you're a public servant, you are to serve the public, and this is the public, and it is worth understanding why people have these experiences and views, and making policy respond better to address those concerns. I think it's pretty simple and straightforward. If you want to be very cynical, I think you could also say it's going to make your life easier in the long run, because if people are very unhappy, you're going to hear a lot more about it. So you might as well bite the bullet and start engaging with people now and figuring it out and trying to work together, than, you know, just waiting for the storm to hit, which it inevitably will on a lot of the topics that we're talking about.
Thanks for the question. I think this is a really, really important one, because I think if a colleague doesn't know why they're doing it or why it's important and do it anyway, the biggest risk is it's badly done tick box exercise that just actually undermines trust and engagement in the system. So I think it's one of the most important questions. So why would you engage people? And the answer to that will be different depending on the type of policy. If it's a service design, you might be engaging a potential user so that the service is going to land in a good way. If it's a different type of policy, so for example, I worked on climate and agriculture as one of the NESC projects, it wasn't so much about user design, but it might be about there's very different interests and trade-offs, so trying to find the types of policies that will work for both without alienating groups and getting trust and buy-in. So there's going to be, and that's only two examples, there's probably a million different types of whys depending on the type of policy. So I think that question is the vital starting point. Why would I engage someone in this particular policy? And there's multiple reasons, good reasons why, but being really clear about the specific why for the specific policy has to be the start, because that determines what type of engagement, who you engage with, you know, how you imagine it having a result back into the policy so that you can feedback, and so on and so on. So I think it's probably one of the most important questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Niamh. Great point to potentially leave it on. I'm very conscious one of our panellists has to leave now, but I really wanted to offer the rest of you an opportunity if there was any reflection you had on the morning before I hand back to John, who has instructions for the rest of the afternoon. So are there any final reflections you'd like to share? Niamh, we might start and come back down this way.
Great.
Yeah.
No, I think it's been a fabulous day. One thing that I suppose has jumped out at me and is staying with me was Sally had one of the diagrams up where it looked like a load of post-it notes of the different types of engagements at different levels for different approaches. And when she said to us, either as academics or civil servants, what next, I think under the civil servant list of bullets, she referred to maybe as a decision tree. I'm not sure exactly her exact meaning by it, but what I'm taking away from it that could be really useful, I think she suggested as in addition to this kind of guidance, is that thinking through the different types of engagement depending on the different types of policy issues, and getting, I suppose it can seem like a black box. Public engagement is all these things, but they're all very different and for different purposes and different reasons. So I think unpacking and getting deeper into all of those different options and when you would best apply one in this situation versus another in a different situation could be a really helpful next step. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Niamh. Naomi?
Yeah, I suppose that one reflection that I would have from today is that, collectively, I think we all have a strong value in terms of making Ireland a better place or the world a better place, and I think it's really important that we see the perspectives that we bring to that. So whether we're from a different interest group or whether we're from the government or the policy maker, collectively we do want to engage and create better policies for everyone in Ireland, and just to be open-minded really when we do that, and to see, I suppose, we have more in common than we have that's different, and really just, I think that collaborative approach is really critical.
Thanks, Paddy.
One of the key sort of themes for the sector I work in and love working in the local authority sector is that our role is to serve, lead and represent our communities. And I suppose the leadership there is a key thing, and the legitimacy comes into that context. So, as I said, we're the local authority sector. We're a key core part of what we do is informed by the elected members who are elected by the people, and our biggest sort of challenge is to, provide the leadership and retain the trust and the credibility of our communities and our citizens. So, again, when we're engaging with our communities in whatever different projects or endeavours we're about, is to have regard for the national challenges, the national issues, but to be able to deliver and work with our communities and retain, I suppose, as best we can, credibility in what we're about, and that expect that the communities do look to us for leadership in the challenges that they face.
Thanks, Paddy. And the final word to Tanya.
I suppose Paddy and I work together with the culture teams in every local authority, and I look at how much is being asked of local government, and one of the things that really shone through for me is it's such a real local democracy, real local participation and consultation. I don't think that is being served enough in the structures as we currently have, with a lot of central government, asking Paddy and his colleagues to do so much. So that sort of more rebalancing of the local democracy. And picking up on what our New Zealand speaker said, I wrote down mindsets, methods, capability and leadership. So do we have the capabilities within our various central government agencies, local government, have we got the capacities to really do that kind of public engagement well? It is a skill. Yes, as Niamh said, many different ways, many different modes, but do we actually at the moment have that capacity internally?
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you. I know an awful lot of these themes will actually be echoed in this afternoon's panel as well, so I hope you can stay with us for the rest of the day. But I hope now you can join with me in thanking our amazing panellists, and thank you all so much for your time. And we'll hand back over to John for final instructions, John.
So thank you so much, Francis, for an expert in moderation. I think a special round of applause for Francis. If we can come back for 1:15, that would be really helpful. I think part of these events, it's also... You've got 7 minutes to have your lunch. 2:15, thank you. One of the nice things about these events is it's actually it's the dialogue, it's the conversation, it's the networking and so on. So let's keep our hour for our lunch and just to make the most of those opportunities. Thank you everybody for this morning's work. Well done.